Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. I am here to answer your questions about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, all of his books, or the man himself. And of course, if you look in the description, you will see a link to my Quora account, which is where I would like you to submit your questions. Of course, if you leave a comment with a simple question that I can answer, I will answer you on there. But if you want to be featured in a video, go through Quora, write the question there, and tag me in it. And every week, Wednesday night, I will pick my favorite questions and feature them in a YouTube video. So let's see. Let's get right into it, because I'm trying to make these not quite so long, but they always wind up being long. So this first question was submitted anonymously, and this person asks, could Tulkas have defeated the armies of Sauron and Saruman single-handedly? Yeah, big time. The mere presence of Tulkas would mean that there would be no resistance from Saruman, or any of their followers. They would immediately surrender and beg for pardon. Tulkas was the most warlike of all of the Valar, and if he shows up, surrender is really the only option. Many millennia ago, before the birth of the sun, Sauron's master Melkor was besieged by the Valar at his fortress at Utumno. And this was a conflict called the War of the Valar. That's what it was referred to in The Lord of the Rings, or the Battle of the Powers. Upon breaking into the fortress, the mighty Tulkas broke out into booming laughter. He was so happy, so thrilled to finally get to see some action and engage Melkor in combat. We get the feeling that Tulkas has been wanting to kick his butt for a while. And there was also Aroma, who was blowing his horn, and it just scared the hell out of Melkor. And this is literal, because Utumno means hell. So they were in hell, so to speak. So, this was Melkor at kind of the height of his powers. He was said to be as powerful as the other 14 Valar put together. And still, between Aroma blowing his horn and Tulkas' booming laughter, Melkor realized, I don't stand a chance here. Just give up. So Sauron, Saruman, and a bunch of orcs and trolls, they would probably evacuate their bowels upon hearing Tulkas' laughter. Okay, so this next question, this is another anonymous one. Aragorn stopped King Theoden from slaying Grima. So this is the movie, okay. Who told Saruman of the weak spot in the wall before the war at Helm's Deep. Is Aragorn ultimately responsible for the breached the wall that held in all previous wars? No, of course not. It's from the movie, because this didn't really happen that way in the book, but I think it's silly to blame Aragorn because he spared Grima. Now, in the book, I do have to talk about this, Aragorn didn't have any part of this. Theoden himself wished to spare Grima, and he offered him a full pardon only if Grima was to ride out to battle alongside his king as a man of Rohan. He was sort of trying to reach out and remind Grima that he was once a Rohirrim, a man of honor, a man of Rohan, and saying, ride out with me for good or ill, and you will be forgiven. And that didn't happen. He just ran. Grima just ran, and he was allowed to run. The guards moved to stop him from running out of the palace, and Theoden was like, just let him go. Theoden was hoping that he would put himself into exile, but instead he just ran straight to Saruman. He went right to Isengard. So, regardless of who it was that decided to spare Grima, whether it was Theoden or Aragorn, it was Theoden's decision anyway. Aragorn advised him, but he wasn't the king. He might be the king of Gondor, or to become the king of Gondor, but he's not the king of Rohan. You can't say that somebody is responsible for the actions of another person because they didn't kill that person. it puts a really kind of a negative connotation on the concept of mercy, and that sort of, I think it flies in the face of anything that Tolkien would have believed, the lessons that he's trying to impart to the reader. Let's use Gollum as an example. Gollum was this horrible wretch pretty much his entire life, and Frodo remarked, it was a pity that Bilbo did not kill Gollum when he had the chance. And Gandalf rightly chided him for that. He said, that's a whole full philosophy lesson about, can you give someone life? Can you give someone death? But I want to focus on something else here, not simply the philosophy of mercy, but even, something else that Gandalf said, even the wise cannot see all ends. So if Bilbo had killed Gollum, it may have alleviated a lot of suffering. We talked about Gollum eating babies in a previous video. Those babies, we have to assume, would not have been eaten by Gollum if he was killed by Bilbo. But then also the One Ring wouldn't have been destroyed, and Sauron would have swept over Middle-earth and won. So basically, it doesn't work like that, is what I'm saying. If Grima had been killed, okay, maybe he wouldn't have run to Saruman and told him about the weakness in the wall at Helm's Deep in the movie, but it was also Grima that killed Saruman. So even the wise cannot see all ends. You don't know what's going to happen. Yes, sparing someone might lead to something bad, but that's still that person's choice to make. You hope that they would make a better choice for being spared, just as in the book Theoden hoped that Grima would ride out with him and be redeemed in that fashion. Grima chose otherwise. Okay, so this next question, another anonymous one, but this is a really good question. This person simply asks, who is an obscure but important character in the Lord of the Rings series? And I thought about this for maybe 5 minutes before I decided on who I was going to say, and I decided to talk about Fatty Bolger. Fatty Bolger, his name is Fredegard Bolger, he's fatty to his friends. He was one of the conspirators, which were several young hobbits who knew about the One Ring. They didn't know it was the One Ring, but they knew about Bilbo's ring, and they knew that Frodo had Bilbo's ring, and they knew that Frodo was planning to leave the Shire, and they wanted more than anything to just help him in any way they could. The other members of the conspiracy were Sam, Merry, and Pippin. So Fatty's job was that Frodo moved to Crickhollow from Bag End, which was in Hobbiton, to Crickhollow, which is in Buckland. And from there, he could sort of quietly and secretly leave the Shire and travel to Rivendell. But Fatty would stay there at Frodo's house in Crickhollow and sort of pretend to be him. He even wore his clothes. It made his house seem lived in, made it seem like Frodo hadn't left yet, and they were just trying to keep that up as long as they could before it was discovered that Mr. Baggins was no longer there. And he was a really good decoy. And he was very brave. Because the hobbits, they were creating their conspiracy. They didn't know about the Black Riders, right? The Nazgul. And when they were fleeing the Nazgul by going into the Old Forest, Merry tried to convince Fatty Bolger to come with them, saying that, look, any stories you've heard about the Old Forest, about how scary it is there, it's not as messed up as these Black Riders. These guys are really, really scary. You do not want to stay here. But Fatty, first of all, he didn't want to go into the forest, and he understood that his role was important, and he decided to stay anyway. And eventually, the Nazgul did come. They busted the door down. He fled out the back. He ran a really long way, and he raised the alarm. He was out there screaming, fire foes, we're being attacked. And the hobbits all kind of woke up, and, because this was the middle of the night, and the Nazgul had to flee. So it was actually really important, the role that Fatty did. And he turned out okay. He was captured by Saruman, but he wound up being released after the Battle of Bywater. He was not Fatty anymore. He had lost a lot of weight, although I'm sure his friends still called him that. And the only other mention of him is that his sister wound up marrying Merry. So he's kind of an obscure character. He's in the very beginning of Book 1, and then he sort of appears again in Book 6, but still important to the plot, still sort of an underrated character. Didn't really get to be in the movie. He was just sort of at Bilbo's birthday party, and Bilbo made a comment like, oh, Fatty Bolger, and that was it. They cut his whole part out, really. Okay, so this next question was asked by Angela Teo, who asks, why is it said that Glorfindel did not participate in the first kinslaying, that's the kinslaying of Alcolon, though he was of the host of Turgon? So I had to sort of mull this one over a little bit because I wasn't sure exactly what was being asked, but I believe that if I'm understanding the question properly, you're wondering, why was Glorfindel an exile? Why was he a Noldorian exile if he had no part in the kinslaying? And I have to remind you that there were many of the Noldorian exiles did not take part in the first kinslaying. For example, there was Galadriel. She had nothing to do with it. She merely wanted to travel to Middle-earth to find and rule a fair kingdom. Fingolfin had nothing to do with the kinslaying. He was there, but he didn't kill any elves. And he was traveling to Middle-earth to keep an eye on Feanor, who he did not trust to be the king of the Noldor. He felt that Feanor was going to lead them to ruin, and he in fact did lead them to ruin. So, you know, not everybody that went and became an exile was an elf who killed somebody. And Glorfindel really didn't even want to go, but he was very loyal to Turgon, and Turgon was very loyal to Fingolfin. And these are the elves that crossed the Helcarax. They didn't even use the stolen ships because they had no part in murdering the Teleri elves and stealing their ships. So they went the hard route. They went the route that took 27 years on foot across the ice desert, the Helcarax. So, you know, there was Turgon, there was Glorfindel, there was Fingolfin. They went for various different reasons, but they were still exiles nonetheless. Good question, though, once I figured out what you meant. Okay, so this next question, this is another anonymous one. Why was... Oh, I like this question. It's one of my favorites. Why was Fangorn Forest thought of as a dreadful, dangerous place to venture into when it was the domain of Treebeard and the Ents, not Sauron, who dwelt in Dol Guldur? So what you see a lot of in The Lord of the Rings is there is a general ignorance of other parts of the world. And this actually makes a lot of sense when you really stop and think about what type of place Middle-earth really is. When asked about why Fangorn Forest has such a negative reputation, with Celeborn himself warning the Fellowship against going anywhere near it, Treebeard replied, well, that's curious, because had he been asked, he would have given the same advice about the Forest of Lothlorien, where Celeborn was. He would have said, don't go there, it's dangerous. So you see these sort of fears from people who generally stick to their own domain and they don't venture out into the world. Boromir is a good example. Boromir feared Lorien. Boromir didn't want to go anywhere near Fangorn Forest. He learned that Lorien was a fair realm. He never made it to Fangorn, though. But he believed that it was a place of evil and mystery, and he would go there if necessary, but he really didn't believe it was a good place. There are always rumors of other lands, and they're usually not good rumors. And this is because travel across Middle-earth has become generally dangerous. It's unsafe, especially in the Third Age. To give the example of the Shire and the nearby settlement of Bree. They were neighbors, and they were once good friends. They were trade partners, and there was a lot of travel between the two. But as the roads became less and less safe, less men were going to the Shire, less hobbits were going to Bree. There were hobbits that lived in Bree, of course, but there was less interconnectivity between them, and it sort of fostered this thought of, they're weirdos over there, they're not like us. Even in the Shire, the different parts of the Shire, the different farthings, they thought, well, those people in Buckland are weirdos, and then you go to Buckland, it's those people in Hobbiton are weirdos, and you see it all over the place. And this is why the Fellowship was important. You have two men, 4 hobbits, an elf, a Maya, and a dwarf, all traveling together. And yeah, they bicker sometimes. They have cultural differences, such as Legolas and Gimli sniping at each other, or Aragorn is constantly having to check Boromir and his incorrect assumptions. The hobbits think everything is weird. They're scared of everything that's not familiar to them. but they forged bonds and they grew close, and it would have been unthinkable before the war for a dwarf to go to Fangorn willingly, or an elf to go to the Glittering Caves. But out of friendship, they did these things that made them uncomfortable previously, and they learned about the other races, and the whole world just became friendlier. And that's sort of the whole point of the story. Excellent question. Okay, so this question was submitted by Dan Birchall, I think it's Dan Birchall, who asks, how indestructible are the Palantiri of Tolkien's Middle-earth? So, these things were probably made by Feanor. We don't know for sure, but probably made by Feanor. That's what Gandalf thought when he spoke of them. He mentioned they were of a great elven craft, possibly Feanor. And like most of his crafts, the exact making of the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones, is unknown and cannot be replicated. So we don't really know how tough they are, right? We don't know how many Palantiri there were total. We know that 7 of them made their way to Middle-earth. They were brought by Elendil. And there was never a sure instance of any of them being destroyed. They were just lost. So I'll just run through them. The Stone of Osgiliath was lost during the Kinstrife of the Third Age, and it wound up in the Anduin River. Never saw it again, bottom of the river. The Amansul Stone was also drowned. It went down with King Arvedui in a shipwreck, and he actually had 2 stones, because the third one is the Anamina Stone that was also with him. So that's 2 stones, 3 stones that went up at the bottom of water, 2 of them with King Arvedui, the others in the Anduin. Number 4, Minas Ithil, that stone. This one, they assumed it was destroyed when Minas Ithil fell, but we wound up finding out that that was not the case. Sauron had it. So we know that one was not destroyed. That was the one that Sauron had. Number 5, the Stone of Minas Anor. Now this one was locked away. The men of Gondor realized that Sauron might actually have the Minas Ithil Stone, and therefore it's unsafe. Now this one Denethor had, and he actually wound up, he had it with him when he burned himself to death. He was clutching it. And for years afterward, all you could see in it was burning hands. So it kind of sort of damaged it, the fire, but didn't destroy it. They said the people who were the most powerful and the most wise could see other things in it, but most people who would look into this Palantir would only see burning hands. Number 6 was the Elostrian Stone. So this one the elves had, and men never used it. Círdan took it with him when he left Middle-earth. So that one was never destroyed or anything like that. And then there was the Orthanc Stone. That's number 7. That's the one that Saruman had. And Grima threw it from the high tower. It bounced off of a metal balcony. It then hit the ground. It was fine. Pippin used it. Aragorn used it. It didn't get destroyed. So we don't really have a way of saying how indestructible are they, because it seems it's never really been put to the test. Some of them are locked away, some of them are just fine. One was burned and it seemed a little damaged, right? But it still functioned, just in sort of a weird way. The Minas Ithil Stone was probably the one that, came the closest to being destroyed, because Minas Ithil sort of fell upon it, and then it was rebuilt as Minas Morgul. It was believed destroyed by most, except, the men of Gondor who were wise figured it's probably still there, All of the other Palantiri were probably, in Numenor, and now the Akalabeth may have destroyed them. But for all we know, maybe not. Maybe they're on the bottom of the ocean, maybe they're in the Balagir Sea, lying there perfectly usable, but just many miles under the ocean. So basically, we can't really know because it's never been put to the test. We don't know what they're made out of, much like any of Feanor's crafts. Okay, so this next question was requested by Alice Stone, and Alice asks me, how does The Lord of the Rings act as a critique of industrialization and progress, and what does this say about Tolkien's environmentalism? This is a really well thought out question. So Tolkien certainly distrusted machines, and he loved greenery. And this absolutely comes into his works. The origin of Tolkien's distrust of machinery would be when he was a young man, he went off to war. He went and fought in the Great War. We know it as World War II. He came home, and he found that his home was less green than when he left. There were more machines. There was greater technology. And he sort of lamented this. It was sort of like the end of his childhood. Now, going to war is sort of the end of your childhood, right? But as a young man, you figure he will come home and things will be the same, and they're not, and they're never really the same. When he created the concept of the Shire, Tolkien shows something that's similar to, I spoke about this a bit last week, it's the verdant hills and fields of his youth. It's home. It's unpolluted by machinery and the ravages of industrialization. It's the ideal England, at least according to the author, and the mythological hobbits that inhabit it. So the hobbits come home from their own war, and they find something very similar. Trees have been uprooted, there's industrialization, there's machines, Saruman has taken over, there are evil men in the Shire. But since it's a fantasy story, it's not realistic, nor is it meant to be. They can rise up and fix these things. They can make it the way it was, right? Except Saruman said something interesting. Saruman was the architect of their misery, and he pointed out it will never be the same. So there is that little bit of Tolkien's experience in there. He says they will find it difficult to put right in their lifetime what he has done to the Shire. So Tolkien, in his own life, he seemed to fear, distrust, or just loathe machines and technology. There's a famous audio clip of Tolkien reading The Ride of the Rohirrim from The Return of the King. And this was actually recorded before The Lord of the Rings was published. He had gotten sort of dejected. He couldn't find a publisher. He was starting to think maybe it's just no good. Maybe the work is just bad. So his friend had the tape recorder. They recorded him reading that part out. They played it back. And he was sort of like, wow, that's really good. The tape made it good. And that's the uplifting part of the story that gets told. But there's sort of the other part of the story that Tolkien was actually sort of like, whoa, what is that thing? He was a little bit sort of, I don't want to say like afraid of the tape recorder, but kind of, you know, he was sort of a technophobe in a sense. And he distrusted it. And he actually would not use the machine or even go near it until he said a prayer over it and blessed it. So then he used it. So he never really got used to the steady increase in industrialization and only went along reluctantly, grumpily. He had a family car. I mean, he had a few cars. He had one that he called Joe. He had another one that he just referred to as the Machine. Just imagine that. Edith, Christopher, we're going to travel. Everybody get in the machine. You know, it's kind of an unusual thing to think about, but that's just the way he was as a person. His choice of heroes shows his desire for conservation and protecting the environment. Galadriel has a ring of power that keeps Lorien without decay and perfectly green. Even winter is beautiful in Lorien. Gandalf told Saruman, "He who breaks a thing to find out how it works has left the path of wisdom." Faramir was the prince of Ithilien. It's the most beautiful land in all of Gondor. He was a ranger. He moved in nature. Even when he had a base, he didn't build a base. He just used a cave. He didn't mar anything. And then, of course, we have Tolkien's chief hero, Sam Gamgee, the gardener, right? He repaired the Shire. He planted malern trees. And I got a comment when I posted this on Quora, like, he only had one acorn. Like, okay, but then the tree that he planted would bear acorns. So he actually, he did plant multiple malern trees. It just took a while. And he's an expert gardener. He knows what he's doing. Sam was actually the only one who was willing to give up the quest, almost willing to give up the quest at one point, because in the Mirror of Galadriel, he saw a vision of the Shire being marred. And he was so fired up by trees being uprooted that shouldn't, and buildings being put up in places that should be green, he almost wanted to march back home and solve this issue with his words and his fists. Now, then you look at Tolkien's villains. They like technology a bit more. They like machines a bit more. Goblins can't make beautiful things, but they can make crafty things, and they can make cruel things. Saruman dammed the rivers. He felled the trees. He turned Isengard from a garden city to a factory city. And of course, there was the machine of war driven by Sauron and Morgoth before him. So you might say that the instant communication that they have, the Palantiri, that's sort of like a telephone, right? It could be a critique of telephones in his mind, or not as an allegory, of course, but just sort of as a little jab, you know? Imagine what Tolkien would have thought of the internet. So Tolkien could not even bring himself to write the sequel, the New Shadow. He got a few pages in, but the Fourth Age's lack of wizards, elves, and magic was depressing to him, and he felt it wasn't worth reading, it wasn't worth writing. It was not an ongoing story about the race of men. You're going to have technology then, right? Because they don't have magic to rely on. So that's why he scrapped the New Shadow. So I hope I covered everything there. Let's move on to the next question, which is anonymously submitted. This person asks, what are the logistics of Minas Tirith? How are the people fed, and where are the farms located? So, okay, I think the movie sort of muddied the waters on this, but the whole area around Minas Tirith, literally right outside of it, is the fields of Pelennor. The movie made it seem like Pelennor Fields was far away from Minas Tirith, but in the books, Minas Tirith was right on the Pelennor Fields, and this was the really fertile farmland. This is what fed the people. It was right outside the city the whole time. No great distance. Also, it was a fortress city, and they had a great store of food there. So Minas Tirith could endure very long sieges if they need to. And having those farms certainly let them, make a great store of food. Okay, next question. Another anonymous one. Right, is this yes, it is. Okay. So this one asks, if humans and elves were created by Eru Ilúvatar, dwarves were adopted by Eru Ilúvatar, and orcs were made by Melkor in mockery of elves, who or what created hobbits and gave them free will? Okay, essentially hobbits are human, right? They're basically human. Hobbits are an offshoot of the race of men, and one might even say that they are men, they're just a different kind of man. Out of the three ancestral races of hobbits, the Stores were said to be the most man-like. They're not as tall as the Fallowhides, they have broader frames, they have large hands and feet, they could grow beards, whereas the others could not. They would wear boots, whereas the others would not. So the earliest hobbits were the river people, and Smeagol was one of those. Gandalf said they're the fathers of the Stores, and if we look at the linguistics of all, hobbit means hole dweller, but halfling means half man. So the early hobbits were probably just a race of men that were half the height of typical men, and they just decided to become river-dwelling nomads, and that's where hobbits sort of came from. You could even say that Fallowhides and Harfoots might also have come from men of different parts of the world. So basically, they are 100% children of Ilúvatar. Okay, so this next person is anonymous, and they just asked, I'm having trouble getting into the Silmarillion. Have you got any tips? Maybe slow down. All right. It's a dense read. It's a lot, and I do mean a lot of information. I don't know if you already have read the other books, but The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you should read those first. And then actually, I would recommend Unfinished Tales before the Silmarillion, because the style of it is sort of a good halfway point between The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. If you're still kind of struggling, I would recommend go back and read Lord of the Rings again, and pay close attention to the passages that a lot of people's eyes sort of glaze over, the songs, the poems, because a lot of it is old lore that harkens back to the Silmarillion, and a lot of those references make a lot of sense in context if you've read the Silmarillion. It might pique your interest to sort of look at those again. If you still find it too dense, you can't get into it, you don't really need to read it if you don't want to. There are some novels that are based off of the Silmarillion that tell the most important chief stories of it as standalone novels. So you could get The Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin, and The Fall of Númenor, and just read those instead. Okay, so this next question is asked by Thomas Snurdley, and he asks, how did the surviving members of the Last Alliance dispose of Sauron's corpse? Grave, cairn, pyre, or something else? So this is a cool question. I like this one. You're talking about at the end of the Second Age, Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hands. What happened to Sauron's body? So I think, Tolkien doesn't really talk about this, but I think it's likely that Sauron's body probably just withered away into dust pretty quickly. Sauron was and always has been a spirit. He's an angel that can take many forms, but all of his forms, all of his bodies are just like cloaks to the spirit, like clothing that he wears. In the Silmarillion, there's a section where Huan gets a hold of Sauron, grabs him really good, and Sauron tries to escape by shifting his form several times, but he can't get out of Huan's grasp. And the only way that he's able to do this, to get away from Huan, is by forsaking his body. And that would mean that his body would just be dead and his spirit would depart. So Luthien was there and she taunted Sauron, and she says, if you do that, if you forsake your body and escape us this way, you're going to have to go back to your master Morgoth naked. And he's going to know of your failure, and he's going to have scorn for you and wrath. So you better do as we told. So Sauron relented. He gave them what they were looking for. He did wind up escaping, of course, because they did let him go. But basically, that's the idea, that he could just give up his body anytime he wants. At the end of the Second Age, so Sauron's body's killed by Gil-galad and Elendil. They also died, but they killed him good. He was down for the count. It's not the first time that's happened. He would have gotten back up eventually, probably pretty quickly, and he could have resumed the fight, or maybe just fled back into his fortress, or he could have just left. He could have forsaken his body and become an invisible spirit and gone wherever he wanted to. When Isildur cut his finger off and got him the ring away from him, it was basically, like, the ring isn't a source of his power, but it's part of his power, and it was separating him from a part of his power. He became weaker, wasn't able to re-embody himself so quickly. So it's not stated exactly what happens to Sauron's body, only that his spirit did in fact depart. Isildur certainly thought he was gone for good, and maybe Elrond and Círdan, who were nearby, they might have harbored some doubts about Sauron being gone for good, but they didn't express those doubts. I would say that it's likely that his abandoned body, being just a construct to give his spirit form, probably dissipated in a matter of moments, withering and crumbling into nothing. Good question, though. Okay, next question was asked by Luke Cohen, who asks, what hints are there in the books that confirm Sauron is a fallen angel? There were no hints, it's just stated outright, and I'm going to read you the passage from the Silmarillion. Among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was the spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthaur the Cruel. In his beginning, he was of the Maiar of Aula, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. So Maya strictly translates as beautiful, but it really is the name that the elves had for the lesser angels. The greater angels were the Valar, which translates as powers. The lesser angels were the Maiar. So that is basically telling you that yes, Sauron, or Gorthaur the Cruel, as the elves also called him, was in fact an angel. All right. Another question from Alice Stone, who asks, what was the greatest influence on the development of Tolkien's philology? It would have to be, definitely, 100% the time that he spent at Oxford. At Oxford, he had, I would say there were two seminal moments that would make him a philologist. He was sort of already obsessed with languages, and as it was, but I would say the two seminal moments, one was he heard his teacher read aloud Beowulf in the original Anglo-Saxon, and he said that was the origin of the voice of Gandalf. The second thing was that he translated the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight along with E.V. Gordon, who became a famed philologist on his own, and it helped fuel the love of languages that he had. He started making up his own languages, and the greater scope of his fiction, especially the Silmarillion, is intended to give a historical or mythological context to his languages, because otherwise it's just funny words that mean things, right? For a language to really have meaning, for it to have a philology behind it, it has to have a context, a cultural context. Good question. Okay, here's an anonymous one, but I like this question because it talks about a character we don't talk about very much when speaking about The Lord of the Rings. Barliman Barliman Butterbur the innkeeper. And this person asks, did Barliman the innkeeper ever realize who Gandalf and Strider truly were? Gandalf? No, probably not, right? Strider, yes, he absolutely found out. It's actually mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, in the chapter Homeward Bound, that Barliman did indeed learn that Strider was Aragorn, and that Aragorn had become the king of Gondor and Arnor. And this is relevant because Barliman lived in Bree, which is technically speaking part of Arnor, so now Aragorn was his king. As for Gandalf, his true nature was not known to many. It was a great secret, and even as he returned as Gandalf the White, there were only a few who would know what that really meant, that he returned, and that he was Gandalf the White now. A handful of the elves that were very wise would realize what that meant. Pippin was basically told outright what happened. He may not have understood it fully, but he would have told Merry, and Merry would have understood it a little better, and Bilbo would 100% know exactly what was going on and exactly who he was. Plus, they were all there when Gandalf sailed west, so they knew what he was at that point, right? Bilbo wrote the Silmarillion, the translations from Elvish lore, so maybe, okay, there was a point, and a comment pointed this out, Barliman knew how to read, and he was proud of that. I don't think he would have had the time. He was always busy. He's not gonna... Wait, where is it? He's not gonna read this, right? This is a little too dense for him. He might be proud of the fact that he can read, but this is like a lot of information, right? I don't see him doing that. He was always this really, really busy, harried man. Maybe somebody told him, I don't know, but I doubt that he would have found out. Especially since they don't mention Gandalf. They mention Mithrandir, and at one point Aloran, but he may not have known that was those were other names for Gandalf. All right, final question. I don't usually like, this is the one I'm using in the thumbnail. I don't like to make it at the very end. It just wound up that way, but in The Lord of the Rings, what are they smoking? What are they smoking? Okay, so Tolkien calls it pipeweed. And because the word weed is in there, a lot of people are like, hey, yeah, boy, right? They know, right? Weed, right? They're smoking weed, right? A lot of fans joke around about that. We know it's not weed, right? But we joke around about it, they're smoking weed. Even in the movies, right? It seemed to sort of be like weed, especially in the Hobbit movies. It seemed like Radagast was getting bombed out of his skull just from one hit, off of the pipe. His eyes were crossing, It really seemed like marijuana, but it's not. It's tobacco. Tolkien called it, in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, he called it Nicotiana, or a variation of Nicotiana. That would mean that it's basically tobacco. It's a fantasy equivalent of tobacco, and this was due to the fact that Tolkien was trying to keep Endor, or Middle-earth, as a mythological past of the old world. That's Europe, Asia, Africa. The thing is that tobacco comes from the New World, the Americas, right? So he's like, all right, there are certain things that come from the New World but are so a part of, especially English culture, that you can't leave them out. Potatoes is another one, right? Smoking tobacco. Tolkien loved to smoke, and he wanted to have his characters smoking, so he said, all right, so there's a type of plant, it came from Numenor, it's a form of Nicotiana, it's related to the New World plant, it's not exactly the same thing, but it basically is tobacco. And we can understand that maybe it just vanished, maybe it disappeared, bad crops, bad year, bad harvest, it went extinct, and then was rediscovered in the New World later on. He mentioned potatoes a few times. There was the whole potatoes thing. That's actually, in the movie, and in the book, too. It's not just something that Peter Jackson made up. That hilarious scene was in the book. Pretty much word for word, too. Tomatoes were another one. He mentioned tomatoes in The Hobbit, at least in the first edition. Later on, he revised that out. I guess he felt tomatoes weren't as important to English culture, but tomatoes come from South America, so those were taken out. And I think just with potatoes and with tobacco, he considered them essential. They were important for the characters. Gandalf had to have a pipe, for example. Bilbo had a pipe. Pippin had a pipe. It's just the way it was. So they're not smoking weed, even though it's fun to joke about it. And that meme is rather old. You know, I think it comes from the fact that hippie culture latched onto the Lord of the Rings pretty hard back in the day, but the movies certainly didn't make that meme go away. It only fueled it. But anyway, that was the final question for the day, and yeah, it's still like a 40-minute video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please subscribe, hit the bell to be notified every Wednesday of a new video, and of course, submit your questions on Quora, and I will answer my favorite ones. See you next week.